In January 2015, actor and comedian Stephen Fry was asked a question about how he would respond if he died and met God. Stephen Fry responded, and the response went viral.
I'd say bone cancer in children? What's that about? How dare you? How dare you create a world in which there is such misery that is not our fault? It's not right. It's utterly, utterly evil. Because the God who created this universe, if it was created by God, is quite clearly a maniac. Totally. We have to spend our life on our knees thanking him? What kind of God would do that? Yes, the world is very splendid, but it also has in it insects whose whole life cycle is to burrow into the eyes of children and make them blind. They eat outwards from the eyes. Why? Why did you do that to us? You could easily have made a creation in which that didn't exist.
See, Stephen Fry is an atheist. He doesn't believe in God. And yet to respond to this question, he had to create a picture of God in his mind that he could respond to. It's a harsh, cruel picture of God. It's the God that Stephen Fry doesn't believe in. But it's also the God that Christian Giles Fraser doesn't believe in. In his article, Giles Fraser writes the following: "The other problem with Fry's argument is philosophical. Simply put, there is no such thing as the God he imagines. It is the flying teapot orbiting a distant planet, about which nothing can be said. Such a God doesn't exist." For decades, people have created pictures of the God they don't believe in. Some of them are like Stephen Fry's God, harsh, uncaring. Each week we'll be looking at a different picture of God that people have and considering it and what the Bible says. Well, if you're a Christian, perhaps you've encountered some of these images of God. Perhaps some of your friends have this image of God in their mind as the God they don't believe in. Perhaps you're not sure how to respond when they ask you hard questions about God. Well, what if you're not a Christian? Perhaps one of these images of God is the God that you don't believe in. Perhaps you've thought, even if there is a God, I'd never worship that God because that God must be violent or homophobic or arrogant or intolerant. Perhaps you get frustrated because you think Christians are misrepresenting the God that must exist if there is one. Well, regardless of who you are, this is a great series to be at, to consider some of these images of God in a helpful, deep and real way, and to avoid perhaps some unfair stereotype images of God. Welcome to the series, The God I Don't Believe in.
But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, because he is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven.
Thanks, Marnie. Hey, everyone. Look, we've got a bit to get through here, and I want you to put your sort of thinking caps into gear, okay? If you thought that you could come to church and not have to think or engage mentally, you thought wrong. Now, I have no secret agenda. I am a pastor, and I'm going to talk about the Christian faith. It is a church community, but I'm not trying to sell you something. I'm not trying to convince you necessarily that you have to believe what I believe or what we believe. But I'd like to just address the cultural assumption that Christianity is intolerant. It's kind of restrictive. It limits our freedom, and I want to kind of look at that. So last week, Paul looked at the arrogant God. This week is the intolerant God. That it kind of may be second cousins. So there might be a bit of a crossover between arrogance and intolerance. So just hang in there if you feel you're hearing something for the second time. Now, the common charge against Christianity is that it is exclusivistic, think it's a word that Professor Pete made up there. But you get the idea. It's intolerant, it's narrow-minded, it's elitist, snobbish, self-assured, self-righteous and bigoted. Now, Peter is a Christian, so he's just sort of echoing the charge. So I thought it'd be an equal opportunity sort of pastor tonight. I'll go to Madeline O'Hare. Now, for many of you, you may never have heard of this person, but when Richard Dawkins was just a lad, she was the #1 pin-up atheist in America and changed the culture of America dramatically. You might argue for better, some would argue for worse, through being a very vociferous and aggressive atheist through the 60s and 70s. She said this: Christianity is intolerant, anti-democratic, anti-sexual, anti-life. It is anti-women, and I cannot stand that. It is anti-everything that is good and human and decent and kind and love-filled and understanding. Apart from that, it's okay, I guess. I used to have an intellectual hatred for Christianity. I think that it's broadening now. I'm enjoying hating the whole thing. So that was Madeline's charge in the 60s, and it's kind of filtered through Western culture to be where we are today, held by people in different ways. Now, I think it's a fair charge, and I'm going to sort of address that tonight. Probably this is where we're going, just to hang in there. I want to look at the charges of intolerance. I think it's based on a false view of tolerance. I want to look at the fact that truth claims are not necessarily oppressive or claims to power. Truth is unavoidable. All communities, churches included, have values, beliefs and norms required of their members. It's quite normal for human communities. True Christianity does not impose cultural norms. It's not culturally restrictive. Freedom is nuanced and not simple. And love is ultimate freedom, but it does constrain us. So let's take the first one of those, tolerance. Today it basically means that we accept all beliefs, views and behaviours as true and equal. That's kind of what tolerance means in our culture. But historically, and I think more sensibly, tolerance means putting up with what you find disagreeable or false. Really, tolerance can only exist in the midst of different opinions and different belief systems. If everyone agrees and everyone's on the same page about something, tolerance is kind of irrelevant. There's no need for it because there's nothing to tolerate. Everyone thinks the same. John Dixon said, he's an Anglican minister and sort of public commentator. He said, this is true tolerance, the admirable ability to treat with friendship and respect those with whom you disagree. And he should know, just this last week, Facebook took off a post that he put on. He wanted to have a bit of a conversation about lesbian and gay, bisexual conversations and how we can do that without, unnecessarily hurting or afflicting pain on people who live in that way. And he just sort of put something up on Facebook. Facebook withdrew his post and said it doesn't meet our community standards. Now, it was reinstated when the Gay Pro-Same-Sex Marriage Freedom Commissioner, Tim Wilson, complained to Facebook and said, hey, you can't just remove someone's views because you disagree with them. So they reinstated his post. So he's kind of working out what tolerance means at the moment, and it was kind of great that in the end the post came back up and people could discuss things freely and openly. That's tolerance. I may not agree with this, I may not like that, but I respect your opinion to hold that position, and I tolerate that position in a respectful way, even though I don't agree with it, even though I don't think it's right. That's tolerance, not the other view where just everyone thinks the same and believes the same. Now, often truth is presented in our culture as being restrictive and oppressive, and it kind of flows a bit from Friedrich Nietzsche, the nihilist philosopher, who sort of got this ball rolling in the West. And he said there are no facts, only interpretations, and truths are illusions. You may have heard something along the lines of, there's no objective truth, it's only your opinion or your version of truth. You can thank Fred for that. Postmodern philosopher, kind of a bit of a later disciple, I guess, of this philosophy, John Caputo says that the truth is there is no truth. So when Christians come along and say, hey, we'd like to express something that we believe is true, and we think Jesus is not just true, but the truth, we're kind of in this cultural melting pot of a vague belief that there's not really a thing such as truth. And everyone who claims truth is doing so out of some, secret will to power and to hold, some sort of power over others. And there is kind of some validity to that claim, and I'm not against postmodernism in some of its tendencies. I think in the Bible actually we can find deconstruction as a philosophy actually in some of the biblical accounts. You can talk to me about that later. But ultimately, this is kind of a cannibalistic philosophy. It ends up sort of eating itself. If you say all truth claims are subjective or based on the view to have power over others, and that there's no such thing as absolute truth, you kind of build a scaffolding, but then you saw it off at the same time and you tip over. You kind of end up, that philosophy will devour itself, because you can't make that statement unless you hold to some view of truth. Like, is it true that there are no absolute truths? Is it true that there is no truth? Kind of work that one out. So to make that claim, you have to stand on some sort of support of believing in truth. So I would say the claim that Christianity is restrictive because it claims to be true, or the truth, or Jesus is the truth, it's not so much that that's exclusive, it's something that you need to test and engage, because everyone is claiming some sort of truth, even people who claim there's no truth. If you believe them, that's true. So it kind of eats itself, and it's ridiculous at its base level. So postmodernists, deconstructionists are making truth claims. They're unavoidable, and you have to have some form of truth claim no matter what it is you're claiming. Now, that leads us on to the view of community. And is any community really completely inclusive? And the answer is no, and that's not a bad thing. That doesn't mean that that's wrong or bad. Every community, every tribe, every culture has its norms, has its values, has its beliefs. And to hold those things dearly and as true and precious is not necessarily being exclusive and intolerant. Every community by nature, says Tim Keller, excludes some by the need to create boundaries and certain beliefs. A totally inclusive community is an illusion. We cannot consider a group exclusive simply because it has standards for its members. Now, let me illustrate this with a couple of illustrations. I checked out the New South Wales Gay and Lesbian Rights Lobby website this week, and to join that organisation, you have to first say, I support the objectives of this organisation. I agree to abide by their constitution. And a couple of the things in the constitution read that members should refrain from any form of conduct intended to cause any person offence or embarrassment which may potentially bring the GLRL into disrepute. And members may indicate objection or dissent, but should not willfully disregard or willfully disobey any decision or policy directive given by a person in the organisation authorised to do so. And I thought, that's fair enough. That's completely valid, and I would support that as a Christian for any organisation to have in its constitution requirements of its members. The New South Wales Victorian Liberal Party is no different. If you want to apply for membership, you have to agree and to be subject, that is to submit, to the party's constitution and the rules of the party, one of which includes that the party welcomes anyone who shares its values and would like to participate in the ongoing debate about the best way to achieve those values. So both of these organisations are not being intolerant when they say, we have certain values, certain beliefs, and certain practices that for you to be a part of this community, we expect you to uphold. Now, churches are no different. Churches have values, traditions, teachings, that we hold dear, that we hold true, that we hold precious. And it's not intolerant to say, if you want to be a part of a church community, you're welcome at any point, whether you're an atheist or an agnostic. That's okay. You're welcome to be a part of that community. But to truly enter into its life and its future, you're going to have to come to some sort of position of, well, do I really believe these things too? Do I hold these things dear? Do I accept these as values for myself? And that's not exclusive to call people to that sort of commitment and that sort of participation. Now, that leads us on to whether Christianity is culturally rigid. Now, we should say there is a text hotline, so it sounds kind of funny, but it's true. If you've got some questions, you can just jot this number down here and text them through. And any questions, we're going to take as many as we can. 0498 141 706. It's anonymous, so we won't know who you are, that we're not sort of scanning the airwaves. It's just a sort of a generic mobile we've got. So 0498 141 706, and you can ask some questions. So let's move on to whether Christianity is culturally rigid. And look, I would say kind of no, but you might not be surprised to hear that. I just quote African scholar Lamin Sena, who talks about the way that for many Africans, Christianity has not depleted them of their African cultural identity, but has actually completed and fulfilled that identity. And he says Christianity answered the historic challenge that is in the African worldview of there being supernatural, a supernatural realm, and also this longing for an invincible saviour in African culture. Christianity answered this challenge by a reorientation of the worldview, not replacing it. People sensed in their hearts that Jesus did not mock their respect for the sacred, nor their clamour for an invincible saviour. And so they beat their sacred drums for him until the stars skipped and danced in the skies. Christianity helped Africans to become renewed Africans, not remade Europeans. Now, there might be some questions around that and a mission being colonial in terms of importing Western culture into other nations, and some of that's valid as well. But his statement is saying that as he experienced Christianity in Africa as an African and sees it amongst other Africans, it's not something which stripped them of their culture. It's not something which may force them into some European cultural sort of mould. Andrew Wells is a historian, and he makes the point, and it's very clear in the scriptures, this point. He's talking about the book of Acts in Acts chapter 15, when Christianity was ultimately a Jewish religion, and just Jewish people were really a part of it at this point. And the church came to a head where they had to say, well, there's all these non-Jewish people coming to follow Jesus and accepting him. What do we do? Should they be Jewish? Should they have to submit to the Jewish cultural and religious expectations? And the church in Acts 15 said no, that they can live their culture and be who they are culturally without having to submit to Jewish culture. And so in response to that, Andrew Wells says, cultural diversity was built into the Christian faith. There is no Christian culture the way there is an Islamic culture, which you can recognise from Pakistan to Tunisia and to Morocco. And that's not to diss Islam. He's just noting that culturally, when Islam moves across different nations from its homeland of the Middle East, you'll tend to see a very similar pattern of worship and dress, a sort of a Middle Eastern Islamic culture moving into those new lands as well. Now, I don't actually claim that these pictures really prove that. I think it's much deeper and more sophisticated than showing some pictures, but I believe it can be upheld. And again, that's not to diss the Islamic religion, but just simply to make the point that Christianity doesn't impose dress on women in any culture. It doesn't say how men should pray or separately, or it doesn't. It allows great freedom to the tribe or the culture that it moves into to express the truths of Jesus in relevant cultural forms. You'll see there Saudi Arabia, that's the full face veil there. is the burqa. Down underneath in India, that's the niqab where there's like a slit here. So there's difference in Islamic dress for women. The hijab is in the middle there in China. In Iran, that's the chador. That's a full robe. So there's differences in how the dress is applied, but universally, Orthodox Islamic women are expected to adopt some sort of dress. Christianity doesn't say to women, you need to dress like this. Buddhism, interestingly as well, if you want to really be a devout Buddhist follower, ultimately it's going to move into an expression of clothing, of the way one's hair or lack of thereof is worn, and so on. There's a kind of a culture in Buddhism from its homeland and its heartland and its history, which as it moves across the world, it looks like that in different places. Again, I'm not saying this to diss these religions, just that it is the case. Just a bit of a view of Christianity there. There's Indian women there in their traditional dress. And for Indian women, I've been to India and worshipped with Indian people. They do cover their heads, because culturally that's appropriate for them to cover their heads when they're in church and when they pray. In Africa, there's women there in traditional dress, Indonesians in slightly westernised gear. In Bethlehem there, you've got people Christians in traditional dress in that part of the world, and so forth. So Christianity, I believe, doesn't impose cultural rigidity on other cultures. It actually allows them freedom to express the truth of Jesus in ways that are relevant to them and their culture. And we should also add this in terms of, just back to truth for a moment, the claims of Christian exclusiveness are not for a Christian culture, they're for Christ. Christians, by definition, believe Christ to be God-made man, God in the flesh. So we don't claim an exclusive Christian culture or even really an exclusive set of doctrines that everyone has to adopt. We claim exclusivity for Jesus, that he said he's the truth, that he said he is the expression of God, the Creator in human form, and that's where the exclusivity comes. Now, just as a side point, for those of you who are interested in colonialism and the Western sort of mission into African and Asian lands, there's kind of also a cultural vibe where it's like, oh, mission just destroyed cultures. Western Christians went in there and just kind of ruined their culture and made it really tough for them. Robert Woodbury has done extensive research on nations in the world, and he this is his assertion, that CPs are conversionary Protestants. So they're Christians who went into other lands in mission to call people to become followers of Christ. And he's looked historically at where conversionary Protestants were in certain nations and certain places and measured that against certain indicators of freedom, democracy, human rights, and that sort of thing, over the past couple of hundred years. This is his assertion in a summary. Conversionary Protestants helped foster conditions that facilitated democracy. He's not claiming they were solely responsible for it. But he says by spurring religious liberty, that when they went into countries, religious liberty flowed from the message of Christ. By dispersing mass education, they taught people the Bible and Christian things, but as a result, people were educated and learned to read. By printing, organising civil society, and restricting the extra legal use of violence, forced labour and land confiscation in colonial territories, these reforms undermined the elites in those cultures' attempts to monopolise resources and increase their incentives to allow democracy. His extensive research has said, look, there were some problems, there were some mistakes that people made in mission, no doubt. But ultimately, when we look at the history from where those missions occurred, where people sought to lead people to Jesus, we can see better outcomes in terms of democracy and human rights down the track. And that's an interesting excursus there, if you want to follow that up later. Now, let's have a quick look at freedom. Freedom is not what it's cracked up to be. I guess, and I don't want to be unfair, but I think this is kind of accurate. A sort of a secular view of freedom says there's no real purpose. True freedom is freedom to create your own meaning and purpose. It's like, well, meaning is what you make of it, and it's important to live what you believe and who you are. The Supreme Court has actually defined it as the heart of liberty is to define one's own concept of existence, of the meaning of the universe. So freedom comes down to my autonomy to decide what I think the universe means, what it's about. Stephen Jay Gould, the late Stephen Jay Gould, a very respected scientist, and he's also an atheist, he said, "We cannot read the meaning of life passively in the facts of nature. We must construct these answers for ourselves." That's kind of a secular view of freedom, that we've got to work out what life means. And it flows from Immanuel Kant. And he was writing in the 18th century, and he essentially said, "An enlightened human being does not look to authority or tradition, but trusts in their own power to think for themselves. Today, we value the belief that everyone must decide their own moral values." Now, I would suggest at this point that no one actually believes in ultimate freedom, because you might be able to complete this sentence for me. You are free to do whatever you want to do as long as you don't hurt somebody. You are free to do whatever you want as long as you don't hurt somebody. So even in a secular, non-religious view of freedom, we add a constraint. We say, as long as you don't hurt anybody. That's kind of interesting, I think. Where does that constraint come from? And why would we feel we need to add it? In the scriptures, I guess, what we see presented is a constrained freedom. That love, truly expressed, truly lived, does constrain us. Not as a totalitarian dictator would, but it calls from us certain responses. If two people are in love and they love one another, by the nature of love, they take on constraints. They impose constraints on themselves for the sake of that love. When two people get married, and I've married a lot of people right here, they'll say things like, "I love this person," and in their vows they'll say, "I commit myself to them to the exclusion of all others." And they embrace a voluntary constraint that limits their freedom, but provides a context for love to flourish and grow. Love requires that freedom be restrained at some points. And this is a paradox, but it's true. To experience the joy and freedom of love, you must give up at least some of your personal autonomy. Freedom is not the absence of limitations and constraints, but finding the right ones that fit our nature and liberate us. So, this is where we've been. Charges of intolerance against Christianity, I think, are based on a false view of tolerance. Truth claims are not necessarily oppressive or claims to power. Truth is unavoidable, even for those who claim truth doesn't exist. All communities, churches included, have values, beliefs, and norms required of their members. True Christianity does not impose cultural norms. Freedom is nuanced, not simple, just like you can free to do whatever you want. Love is the ultimate freedom, but it does constrain us. Let me just give you a bit of a snapshot of the God I believe in. And if you want some references to some of these scriptures that I'm paraphrasing, you can see me later. But in some sense, I want to express some of God's intolerance and why it's based in love. God is intolerant of multinational corporations and wealthy elites who defraud workers of their fair wages and extort money from the poor, denying them injustice. God is intolerant of that. God is intolerant of men who abuse their wives and treat them with disdain or divorce them for trivial reasons. God is intolerant of rich people who live in luxury and excess and care nothing about justice and doing what is right for those who are hungry and in poverty. God is intolerant of sham religion and spirituality that doesn't lead to living fuller lives of love, justice, and mercy. God is intolerant of people who abuse others sexually or who betray and cheat on their spouse whom they are meant to love and be faithful to. God is intolerant of those who are violent, who abuse others, or who murder others. God is intolerant of people who trash and destroy the natural world that He created and are cruel towards the creatures that he has made. Jesus is intolerant at religious and social elites who are arrogant and self-righteous and who think they are better than others and look down their nose at them. Jesus is intolerant of hypocrisy when people who do everything for show so that others will praise them. We call these people often celebrities, not just celebrities. Jesus is intolerant of greed and stinginess that fails to show compassion and care towards those with nothing. But I would add this: God is that way inclined out of love that does constrain, does call us to certain standards and certain ways of living, not because of intolerance, but so as to help love flourish. And I would put it to you, if you seriously and wholeheartedly follow Jesus, you would become a less arrogant and less intolerant person. Now, it's true to say there are Christians in our world who, we've all been guilty, if you're a Christian, of being intolerant, of being arrogant. I'm not defending that. That's just wrong, and it goes against the spirit of Jesus. But listen to Jesus on this. If you live like this, if I live like this, it would lead to less intolerance, more freedom, and more love. Let me read this to you from the reading that we had earlier, but from the Message. Love your enemies. Who says that? Jesus did. Let them bring out the best in you, not the worst. When someone gives you a hard time, respond with the energies of prayer for that person. If someone slaps you on the face, stand there and take it. If someone grabs your shirt, gift wrap your best coat and make a present of it. If someone takes unfair advantage of you, use the occasion to practice the servant life. No more tit-for-tat stuff. Live generously. Ask yourself what you want people to do for you, then grab the initiative and do it for them. I tell you, love your enemies, help and give without expecting a return. You'll never, I promise, never regret it. Live out this God-created identity the way our Father lives towards us, generously and graciously. Even when we're at our worst, our Father in heaven is kind, so you be kind. Don't pick on people. Don't jump on their failures. Don't criticize their faults, unless, of course, you want the same treatment. Don't condemn those who are down. That hardness can boomerang. Be easy on people. You'll find life a lot easier. Give away your life. You'll find life given back. But not merely given back with a bonus and a blessing. Giving, not getting, is the way. Generosity begets generosity. Is that intolerant? Is that arrogant? I would claim that if more people live like that, there would be more love, more freedom, more tolerance, more inclusiveness in our culture and our society. And I call you and I invite you to follow that way of Jesus. Now, if you have any questions, we've got a few minutes. Oh, I've got new messages here. We were going to have someone else do this tonight. Was anyone lined up? That's okay. I'll just read them. Okay. All right, what date is it again? There's a new multimedia message. Okay, this beauty popped up on my newsfeed yesterday. What sort of response should we as Christians have to this attitude? How do we penetrate these people's stubborn and closed-off view in order to explain our sinful nature and God's grace without coming off as stubborn and closed-off ourselves? There is a slideshow attached. And the slideshow is Ricky Gervais. It's almost as if the Bible was written by racist, sexist, homophobic, violent, sexually frustrated men instead of a loving God. Weird. Look, I guess, how do we respond to that? Well, I guess you could read the Bible and you could decide for yourself whether you think it was written by racist, sexist, homophobic, violent, sexually frustrated men. What I just read from Jesus, did that sound like a racist, sexist, homophobic, violent, sexually frustrated man? Or did it sound really wonderful? So the fact is, in our culture, sometimes people can reduce things to a meme. And memes are kind of fun on Facebook because it's like, yeah, I believe that. And we sort of gather our tribes around memes. But how do we respond to it? Well, don't respond in like. Jesus says, don't respond with vitriol, don't respond with spite. If you had the opportunity to talk to Ricky or sit down, you could maybe get a hearing and explain what you do believe, what you believe the Bible says, respecting his opinion, but entering into some sort of dialogue to respond to it as well. I just try and avoid memes too, because what sort of a culture reduces its wisdom to memes? Anyway, let's just have a couple more here. Is tolerance even a good aim for us to have towards others? Isn't love more helpful? Yes. That's good. Love is more helpful. I think that's what Jesus just said and what I was leading to. I think love transcends tolerance. While I agree that Christ did not impose or prescribe colonial cultural values or customs, Christians have largely not followed his guidance over history. I think that conversionary Protestants and Christian mission over the centuries have a lot to answer for in having constrained, restricted, oppressed and damaged Indigenous cultures or expressions. In fact, we've often been worse at this than other global religions. And I think that's a fair charge. I don't kind of deny that. History is what it is. I would say this. Is culture universal and unalterable? So if you meet someone or a people or a tribe or a group and that's their culture at this stage, does that mean that for all time and for all of history that culture has to stay exactly the same? That it was altered by some Christian mission is true, but you'd have to establish that there is a basis to uphold that every culture as you find it has to remain exactly the same for all time, otherwise you're a bigot. Secondly, do the people of that said culture have the moral agency and freedom, if they want, to change their culture, to embrace a new culture? That maybe some culture of the West was imposed or brought to those people, but are we saying that they had no ability to either reject that culture or they did not have the freedom, they should not have the freedom to accept cultural aspects of the Western world? So there's two things there. Is culture immutable? And is it like, well, that's their culture, it has to remain the same forever? And secondly, do people have the right and the freedom to change their culture and to take on things from another culture? Like if you were to wear, sort of an Indian, outfit or something, is that okay as a Westerner, or shouldn't you do that because you should just remain Western? There are two things I'd say to that. Now, you don't have to agree with this, or you can chat to me later. I don't mean to be dismissive, but there's just a couple more here. If God is intolerant of so many terrible things, why do these things continue and appear to be tolerated by him in this world? That's a very good question. And if you come next week, when we deal with why is there suffering in the world, why does God still allow suffering in the world, we're going to deal with that in more depth, and not now. How do we maintain friendship with someone of a different faith or position, even someone you've clearly disagreed with on topics of salvation? How do you maintain a friendship with them? Well, I guess if you listen to Jesus, you'd love them, and you would employ at least a level of tolerance where even though they don't believe what you believe or agree with what you believe, you can still be friends. You can still love them and hang out with them and learn from them. And I think Jesus gives us the way to do that. All right, just a couple more. Maybe the band should come up and we'll finish off with a song in a minute. Hi, Nick. Hi, whoever you are. You mentioned bad things that God is intolerant of. Why does God seem more intolerant in the Old Testament, not eating shellfish and other laws, than the New Testament? That's a good question. The Apostle Paul says that the law in the Old Testament was like, and he uses this Greek term called paidagogos, where we get the word pedagogue or pedagogy. And he uses a word and says the law was like a paidagogos, or paidagogos, however you say that. The law was meant to be, and that word in the culture at the time meant the chief slave who had authority over the sons of their owner. They had authority over the sons until they were of age. They were a paidagogos. They were a custodian. They had rights over the son of the householder until the sons came of age when they could enter into their full rights as men of that house. They had custodianship over them. And Paul says the law was put in place to train people, to train a nation, Israel, to train people to learn what God requires, to be a custodian over them, and to prepare them for the freedom that would come when Christ came. And so when Christ came, and we kind of see more grace, more freedom in the New Testament, it's based on the belief that the law trained people for this and readied them by restraining them, by saying, don't do this, don't do that. It taught them and gave them a context for freedom when Christ came and fulfilled the law. Okay, one more. And if you sent one to me, come and talk to me after. You could always suggest to Ricky that it's easy to judge a book by its cover. Try reading it. Good, I'll take that as a comment. Just one more. These are, just seeing what order these come in. There's 3 questions. Thank you for that in one text. Do you have anything to say to the huge damage that was created by Europeans, including our country, that destroyed cultures and peoples in God's name? I think I've kind of addressed that, and I'd also question the assumption because I don't think it's completely accurate. Would it be more fair to suggest that society does not generally consider God intolerant, but rather Christians, and it's things that Christians have done that have given God this intolerant label? And I would agree with that. And just let me finish, if I may, and if you need to go, you can go whenever you want. But I want to finish with this last story in response to that question that, yes, Christians have been intolerant, and I think that's been a great shame. And I just want to come back to Madeleine O'Hare, who I quoted at the start. She was a single mother of 2 boys, both born out of wedlock in the 1950s. She had a lot of unemployment. She was led to Marxism and then to atheism. She tried to defect to the Soviet Union. And eventually she campaigned to stop prayer in public schools, and it went to the Supreme Court and she won. But I kind of think her hatred, her viciousness against Christians and Christianity may well have come about through Christians treating her poorly or not welcoming her. Or if you're a single mum with 2 kids out of wedlock in the 1950s, it's kind of like not now where we'd say, well, it's not ideal, but, we accept you, we welcome you, we want to help you. So quite likely she may have encountered rigid, self-righteous Christians in her early years, and it kind of repulsed her and made her really angry and hateful. And that's just so sad, and it's so true. But I would just say this. When Christians don't live out the central tenets and practices of their faith as taught by Jesus, you can't judge that faith by them. Just like we don't judge Islam by ISIS, you don't judge the Christian faith by errant Christians. You judge it by what the founder taught, what he asks of his followers. That's how you evaluate it. And now, that's not a cop-out, because Christians need to be held accountable, and myself and others, we need to be humble and repenting of those types of attitudes. But I would say give people a chance to hear from Jesus and about Jesus, to help them see that just because Christians aren't always living out what he wants doesn't mean that he is not the truth. We can chat after dinner, afterwards. Thanks, guys. I'm going to finish off just with a song, perhaps. Yeah, and then, great. Ta.